So today we're going to be factoring trinomials again, but this time we're going to factor a trinomial that has a coefficient in front of the squared term. So prior to this we were factoring just an x squared, no coefficient other than 1 in front. So pretty much we're doing the same process, except we're combining using the t-chart with factor by grouping, which you'll see here in a minute. So first of all, as we're looking at our example 1, we need to view this as ax squared plus bx plus c. So in our example, a is the 2, b is 11, and c is our constant 12. So every single one of these numbers has a job. So we are going to still start out with our t-chart as before, and we are going to label our t-chart not with c, because we labeled this here with just c before, but we're actually going to take c and multiply it by a. It's really no different than what we did before. Your a was 1 before, so 1 times that constant was the constant, so that's why we put c over here before. But now we're really going to take a and multiply it by c. So the more times you title your chart with the correct heading, the more likely you are to remember what goes in there. So we're going to take a times c on the left, and we're going to look for b on the right, and we're going to add and subtract. And so our a in this case is 2 times our c, which is 12. So pay attention to signs. 2 times 12 is positive 24. And our b that we're looking for is a positive 11. So you need to start thinking about your signs ahead of time. If we're going to have a positive product, we're going to multiply two things together here to give us this positive product. The only way that we can get a positive product is if we have two numbers with the same sign. So either a plus plus or a minus minus. Because if one number has a positive and the other has a negative, a positive times a negative is a negative, and we would not get a positive here. So I know that we're going to have a plus plus or a minus minus. The other thing I look for is, look at all the signs here. They're all positive. There is not one negative. As soon as one of these here or here is a negative, then you're going to have at least one negative in your parentheses. So since there are no negatives here, my guess is we're going to have a plus plus. But let's see what happens. So my first factors of 24 are going to be 1 and 24. I'm looking for 11, so if I add them I get 25. If I subtract them I get 23. The next number after 1 is 2. 2 divides into 24 12 times. I add them, I get 14, and I subtract them, I get 10. Our next number after 2 is 3, and 3 divides into 24 8 times. 3 plus 8 is 11, and I can actually stop there because 11 is my middle term. So the sign of my 11 is positive. So out of 3 and 8, the largest is 8, so 100% of the time the larger gets the sign, so 8 is definitely positive. The only value or the only sign that 3 could be, in order to combine to 8 to make it bigger, to become 11, 3 would have to be positive, because again, if 3 were negative, if we're adding two numbers with opposite signs, you end up subtracting, which makes the 8 smaller, and keeping the sign the larger. No, we don't want that. So that means that 3 is also positive. Now at this point, we used to just take the 3 and the 8 and throw them in parentheses, and we'd have x plus 3 and x plus 8. However, that's not going to work here, because if I had x plus 3 times x plus 8, if you multiply that out, you are not going to get what we started with at all. You'll get the 11x, but you're going to end up with an x squared here and a 24 here, and that's not our original problem. So instead, we are going to take these two numbers that we've come up with, and since our variable is an x, we're going to attach an x onto each one of these. And these two are now going to become our middle terms. So instead of this 11x, we're going to replace it with a plus 3x and a plus 8x. So this whole term here is going to get replaced with a positive 3x, and that's an arrow, shockingly, and a positive 8x. You are still going to bring down the bookends here and here. Those don't change. So I'm going to bring down the 2x squared and the positive 12. So at this point, we now have 4 terms. So this is where factor by grouping comes into play. So remember, with 4 terms, we're going to cut it in half, take the GCF of the first group, factor it out, GCF of the second group. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to divide this into 2 pieces. The greatest common factor between 2 and 3 is 1, because they don't have 1. And then the greatest common factor in x's, they have 1x in common. So I'm going to divide by an x. What I divide by comes out in front of parentheses. And then our answer is going to go inside. So 2 divided by 1 is 2. And then x squared divided by x, we're going to take 2 x's and take away 1. That leaves us with 1x. So we get 2x. Then 3 essentially divided by 1 is 3. So we've got plus 3. And then these x's right here are going to cancel. So there are no x's. Then, theoretically, what's inside the parentheses here should be what's inside the parentheses on this side. So let's find the GCF of 8 and 12. So both 8 and 12, the biggest number you can divide into those is 4. And they do not both have an x in common. 12 doesn't have an x, so they don't have a variable in common. So that 4 is positive, so it gets brought out in front of parentheses. And then we're going to divide. So 8 divided by 4 is 2. And then you're going to bring down the x because there is nothing for that x to cancel with. Finally, 12 divided by 4 is 3, so plus 3. Then you can see that they both have a 2x plus 3 in common. So this is what we use to divide out, but we're going to encourage you to take a shortcut. Since they both have a 2x plus 3 in common, we would normally divide that out of both of them, so this would disappear, right? And what you have left over is an x and a 4. So that x and that plus 4 goes in the empty parentheses next door. And then this is our final answer. So I'm going to prove to you that that's our answer by checking it. So here's our check. You don't have to do this with every problem, but I would especially do it whenever I'm taking a test, or, hey, how about the EOC? So I'm going to take the problem that we ended up with, 2x plus 3 times x plus 4. And I'm going to use double distribution. You could also use the box method. And I'm going to distribute. So 2x times x gives me 2x squared. 2x times 4 gives me positive 8x. Then 3 times x gives me 3x, which is a like term to the 8x. And then 3 times 4 is 12, no like term, so it gets its own column. Then bring everything down. You end up with 2x squared plus 11x plus 12. And so, so this actually checks. Check, check, right here. This is what we originally started with. So we started with 2x squared. Here's our 2x squared. 11x, here's our 11x. 12, here's our 12. So 2x plus 3 times x plus 4 does indeed give me this. All right, next problem. So in example 2, we have introduced a negative. So nothing changes. We're still going to take a times c and look for negative 14. So here's our t-chart. And then if I go too fast, just pause the video, think about what we've done, and then rewind or restart. So I'm going to label my table. So every table is going to look like this. So my A in this case is 5, and my C is 8. So 5 times 8 is a positive 40, and my B is a negative 14. So again, I'm going to pre-think about the signs of my two numbers that are going to go here. For a positive product, I have to be getting two numbers of the same sign, so a plus plus or a minus minus. Since I have at least one negative in the problem, I know I'm going to have one negative in my numbers here, so my guess is that minus minus is what we're going to end up with. All right, so let's look at our factors of 40. So our first factors of 40 are 1 and 40. They add to give us 41, and they subtract to give us 39, none of which are a middle term. So the next number after 1 is 2. 2 divides into 40 20 times. Add them, you get 22. Subtract them, you get 18. Not our middle term. The next number after 2 is 3. 3 does not divide into 40, so we move on to the next number, which is 4. 4 divides into 40 10 times. If we add them, we get 14, and I can stop right there. So these are the terms I'm looking for. I need to make the 14 negative because that's the sign of our middle term. So 100% of the time, the bigger of the two numbers gets the same sign as your middle term, so the 10 is negative. And we already talked about the fact that our numbers have to have the same sign in order to have a positive product. So the 4 has to be negative. If you're not sure, play around with it, use your calculator, make sure you're getting your signs correct. So now we're going to change these into our middle terms. So we have a y for our variable here, so I'm going to tack on a y here and tack on a y there. And this entire middle term is getting replaced with a minus 4y and a minus 10y. Then don't forget to bring down your bookends, so the 5y squared gets brought down and the positive 8. So we brought these straight down. Then it's just factor by grouping. So we're going to cut this in half. The greatest common factor between 5 and 4 is 1. They don't have anything in common. And if you look at their variables, the most y's they have in common is 1. So we're going to divide each by 1y and pull that 1y out in front of parentheses. Then as you look, well, let's go ahead and do our division. So if we divide that out, 5 divided by essentially 1 here is going to be a 5. And then y squared, take away a y, is going to give us a y. Negative 4 essentially divided by 1 is negative 4. And then y divided by y, the y's are going to cancel. So then look at your greatest common factor between negative 10y and positive 8. So here the difference is anytime this third term here is negative, 100% of the time you're going to have to factor a negative out. Because if you don't factor out a negative from both of these, you are not going to be able to make the first term in the parentheses here a positive 5y. If you have a negative over a positive, that's a negative. The only way to change this negative to a positive is to divide it by negative. Two negatives make a positive. So that has to happen. Anytime that third term is negative, factor out a negative. I can't emphasize that enough. So 10 and 8, the biggest number you can divide them by is 2. They do not both have a y in common, so there's no y as part of the GCF. So pull that negative 2 out in front of parentheses and then divide. So a negative 10 divided by a negative 2 does indeed make a positive 5. Bring down the y because there's nothing for it to cancel with. Finally, positive 8 divided by negative 2 is a minus 4. And so you can see that what they have inside is the same. So that 5y minus 4 gets brought out in front of parentheses. And then what they have left over, the y and the minus 2, are going to be put inside. So here is your final answer. Next problem. So example 3 is very much like example 1. So I'm going to go ahead and do the problem silently. You can either, I would suggest you pause the video, do the problem, and then you can watch what I'm doing, and we'll go from there. So here we go. So there we have our answer of 3p plus 1 times 2p plus 5. Next problem. So in example 4, we have a problem where we do have one negative, but this time the negative is at the constant c. So watch how this changes our signs. So as we write our t-chart, nothing's changed, still have a t-chart, we still have a times c and b over here, and then a plus minus. So in this case my a is 4, my c is a negative 2. So a 4, make that time symbol bigger, so a 4 times a negative 2 is actually going to give us a negative 8. In order to get a negative product, I'm going to have one positive and one negative. So I don't know if it's going to be a plus minus or a minus plus. But as soon as I have one negative in the problem anywhere, I'm going to have one negative in my answer. And for a negative product, only one of the numbers can be negative. So if I'm trying to add or, if I'm trying to combine these two numbers where you have a positive and a negative in order to look for my b over here, you're going to have to subtract these because they're opposite signs. So I'm guessing our answer is going to be here in the subtraction column this time, not the addition column. So here we go. The first factors of 8 are 1 and 8. If I add those, oh, and by the way, I forgot to put up here, my b is a positive 7. Okay, so 1 and 8 add to give me 9, and they subtract to give me 7. Well, right here is my middle term. So my 7 needs to be positive. 100% of the time, the bigger of the two numbers, in this case 8, will also be positive. In order for the 8 to be made smaller to get to 7, we have to subtract to make 8 smaller. So therefore, the 1 is indeed negative. And so this was the one we ended up getting. Now our variable this time is a y, so I'm going to tack a y on here and a y onto here. And same thing as before, we're going to take that whole middle term and replace it with a minus 1y, and you can just write minus y, and a positive 8y. Don't forget to bring your bookends down, so bring down the 4y squared and the minus 2. We have 4 terms, so cut it in half. The GCF between 4 and 1 is 1. They do have one y in common, so we're going to divide by a y and bring that y out in front. So then 4y squared divided by y, you're going to subtract the y's. 4 has nothing to cancel with, ends up being just a 4y. And then we essentially have a negative divided by a positive is going to give us a negative. And then these y's cancel, so you're really left with a negative 1. Then look at the second set. 8 and 2 have a 2 in common. They do not both have a y, so we're not factoring a y out. And this term right here is not negative, so we don't factor a negative out. It's positive, that's what we want. So we are going to put that plus 2, because it's positive, out in front of parentheses and do our division. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. Bring down the y. It had nothing to cancel with. And then a negative divided by a positive is a negative, and then these 2's are going to cancel. So we have a negative, the 2's cancel, so anytime everything cancels, you have a 1. Then what's in parentheses is the same. So we're going to pull a 4y minus 1 out in front of parentheses, and then what we have left is the y and the plus 2. So they get thrown in the parentheses next door. So 4y minus 1 times y plus 2 is the factoring of what we started with, and it should multiply to get you back there. Next problem. So example 5 is just like example 4. So I'm going to go ahead and let you do this on your own, and I'm going to do it silently. Okay, so your answer should be 4x minus 1 times x plus 5. 2 more problems and we're done. So example 6, we now have two negatives. Both of these signs are negative. So let's see how that affects our answer. We still go through the process identically as before. So set up our table. So our A is 2, and our C is negative 15. So 2 times negative 15 is negative 30. With a negative product, you're either going to have a plus minus or a minus plus. We are looking for our middle term of negative 7. So 1 and 30 are our first factors of 30. They add to give us 31 and subtract for 29. Those are not our middle terms. The next number after 1 is 2. 2 divides into 30 15 times. If we add, we have 17, and subtract, we have 13. Not our middle term. After 2 comes 3. 3 divides into 30 10 times. If we add, we get 13, and if we subtract, we get 7. And there it is. So 7 is my middle term, and then we're looking at 10 or 3 and 10 to get us to 7. So since 7 is negative, the bigger of the two numbers, 10, also gets the negative. For 10 to decrease and become 7, this has to be an opposite sign because we need to subtract them. So the 3 is positive, which means that this is what we ended up getting, a plus and a minus. Our variable, whoops, this should be a b. Sorry. So our variable should be a b. So here's a b and here's a b we're going to tack on. And we're going to replace this negative 7b with a positive 3b and a minus 10b. So bring down your bookends, 2b squared and minus 15. So as before, we're going to cut this in half. The 2 and the 3 do not have a common divisor other than 1. They both have at least one b in common, so we're going to factor out a b in front of parentheses. And then the 2 doesn't have anything to cancel with, so we end up with having a 2. And then 2b's minus 1b gives us 1b. Then the 3 doesn't have anything to cancel with, so that stays at 3. But those b's cancel. So we expect that our second set of parentheses here will have a 2b plus 3. Don't force it, but bear in mind, because you might have made a mistake, bear in mind that that's what you're looking for. And if you notice, this first term here, or the third term overall, is negative. It needs to be a positive because our first term here is positive. So I'm yawning. Pardon me for yawning. Oh, it's late. So I'm going to divide both of these by a negative because I need to make that negative 10 be a positive. So 10 and 15, the biggest number you can divide them by is 5. They do not have a b in common, so there's no b in the GCF. So take that 5 and pull it out in front of parentheses. Now you have a negative times a negative, which is a positive. And 10 divided by 5 is 2, and bring down the b. Nothing canceled with it. Again, a negative times a negative is a positive. 15 divided by 5 is 3. And so I have a plus 3 here. And so they do have the same thing inside parentheses, so that 2b plus 3 is going to come out in front of parentheses, and it's going to end up canceling out, and then you're going to have left over a b minus 5. So that goes in the second set of parentheses, and there is your final answer. All right, our last problem. So our last problem actually has a negative here in front of the coefficient of the squared term. We never, ever, ever want our squared term to be negative. So we are going to factor out a negative. Now, if all three of these numbers have a greatest common factor, we would, of course, factor that out. But in this case, they don't. So we are going to start from the very beginning by factoring out a negative 1 from each one of these. And essentially, that's going to change the sign of everything inside. So everything inside changes signs. So all these negatives change to positive. So you got positive 2x squared plus 15x plus 7. So now when we do our table over here, when you go to multiply A and C, A is a positive 2, not a negative. C is a positive 7, not a negative. And so we're going to have 2 times 7, which is a positive 14. We're going to be looking for a positive 15 because we changed the sign, right? So our factors of 14 would be 1 and 14. They add to give us 15, and there it is. So I don't even have to go on. So our 15 is supposed to be positive. That means the 14, which is bigger out of the two, 14 and 1, the 14 has to be positive. So remember, for this product right here to be positive, we have to have 2 negatives or 2 positives. Since I know the original problem had negatives in it here, but we're looking at only what's in parentheses here. Since there are no negatives inside parentheses, my best guess is going to be that we're going to have a plus plus, so the 1 needs to be a plus. And sure enough, positive 1 plus positive 14 is a positive 15. So then we're going to tack on the variables here, which is x. So we've got an x, a 1x, and a 14x. So this is going to get replaced with a positive 1x and a positive 14x. Don't forget to bring down your bookends, 2x squared plus 7. However, let's not forget that the whole thing is being multiplied by negative 1. So I'm starting to run out of room. So I am going to still cut this in half, and I'm going to put my next set of work, well, I don't like the way that turned out. Let's try this again. I'm going to put my next answers here. So as I look for a GCF, well, first of all, I'm still going to have right here a negative 1. I'm just going to use brackets for right now. So I'm going to work the inside as if that negative 1's not there. So the 2x squared and the x, they don't have any numbers in common. You can't divide 2 and 1 by the same thing other than 1, but they do each have an x in common. So I'm going to take this x out in front of parentheses, and I'm going to divide it. And so I end up with 2x squared divided by x is just 2x. And then x divided by x is going to be plus 1. Then between the 14 and the 7, we can divide those by 7. They do not have an x in common. The 7's positive, so I'm going to put a plus 7. And then 14x divided by 7 is going to give us a 2x, which is what I'm looking for. And then 7 divided by 7, those are going to cancel, and you get a plus 1. So now what's in parentheses is the same. This negative 1 out in front still doesn't change, but I'm going to take that 2x plus 1 out in front of parentheses, so those are going to cancel, and you're going to have an x and a plus 7 left over, and so those go in the second set of parentheses. So now all addition subtraction signs are inside of parentheses, and we've cleared everything. Now the proper actual way to write this is, instead of a -1 out in front, you just have a negative, and you can drop the brackets and just write 2x plus 1 times x plus 7. And so our very final answer is right here. So moral of the story goes, if you start out with a negative in front of the squared term, 100% of the time we want that highest degree term, in this case the squared term, to be positive. And that, my friends, is the last example for section 7-4. Now you know almost everything there is to know about factoring. Almost.